Alright, hello and welcome to another Marvel Snap video. So I wanted to look at a different kind of video for today. I wanted to go over what makes a good and how to build good Marvel Snap decks. I think it's a very interesting topic, and it's a topic that I enjoy a lot of. It's how I make most of my content is by coming up with different decks. So I kind of wanted to give some ideas for newer players or people who maybe don't feel like they're very good at deck building, so they have to use content creators' decks. Just kind of spread some light on what I think are some good tips. This is what works for me, and I think are general broad strokes. So it's not going to go too in depth as to what cards are really good here and what cards are really good here. More so, these are generally good cards to use, and these are good things to have in your deck. And it'll make more sense as it goes on. So, I kind of wanted to start with, it's important to know what Marvel Snap is. Marvel Snap has 3 locations. You need to win 2 of them by having more power than your opponent. So generally your cards are going to want to have a way of having more power than your opponent. There's a few different ways you can go about that, obviously. One, and the most obvious, is have really big cards. So if you look down here, at the very bottom, you got really big cards. So a logical first step would be use something like this. This guy's a 620, he's the biggest card in the game. The other way would be preventing your opponent from playing really big cards. So that would be called using a tech card or teching your opponent. So Shang-Chi would accomplish this. He destroys cards that have more than 10 power, which is probably why you don't see this guy around very often, because he could just get destroyed. So there's a balance. You can play big cards, or you can prevent your opponent from playing big cards. And then, those are both extremes. Then there's a big gray area in the middle that a lot of decks will fall into. Most decks do not play just really big cards or just tech cards. It's possible to do both those things, but a lot of decks will fall somewhere in the middle. So it's important to understand that when you're looking at it. So when I'm looking to build a deck, there are 2 general ways that I look and I think when I'm trying to build a deck. It's either, am I trying to build a deck around a concept? So I want to do X, Y, or Z thing, or am I building a deck around a card? I want to use this card, and I'm going to build a deck that will showcase how good this card could be. Both are very valid strategies of deck building, and it just comes down to what you want to be doing in that particular instance. So a good example of I want to build around an idea is the Destroy archetype. There isn't necessarily one card that you would say is the most important card in the deck. There are a few cards that can win you the game, and generally it's the culmination of destroying a lot of cards that will win you the game. So you have Deadpool, which doubles every time you destroy it. So Deadpool can become very large card. Like, I've seen him be a 128 before, so he can get very large and he can single-handedly win you a game. But that he doesn't necessarily need to. Null is the combined power of all the cards destroyed from you and your opponent's side of the board. So Null can be very big, and if you have a very big Deadpool or a very big Wolverine, it also gets really big. You have cost reduction from death. So it's the culmination of all these things, and then Venom, taking the power, that make it a really good deck. You have 4 cards that have enough power on the board to win you the game, and then Arnim Zola even can copy your really big power cards to generate even more power. It then also runs Killmonger typically because it's beneficial to kill your Deadpool, but it also hits your opponent's side of the board. So you're also interfering and disrupting what your opponent wants to do. Which is what makes Destroy a very strong deck. The other ones, and it's pretty easy to have a concept deck because they have this ability select here. So if you want to make a discard deck, for example, another very common and good deck would be just sort by discard and just put in some discard decks. Or if you want to go and move cards, you can select by move. Move is a little bit more of a confusing one because you have self-movers and cards that move other cards or that want to be moved but can't do it on their own. But so that's building around a concept. The other option, like I said, is building around a card. So one of the best examples, in my opinion, would be Patriot. Patriot has the ongoing ability of your cards with no abilities have +2 power. So when you build a Patriot deck, you're building around him. You're running cards that either generate cards with no abilities or that have no abilities on their own. A lot of decks revolve around Ultron specifically because he fills all the other locations with drones that are 1/2 textless cards, so they get the Patriot buff. So it just comes down to how you want to build, what you want to be doing. Both are valid strategies and both can generate very powerful decks. So don't be deterred of, oh, I have to build a concept deck, or oh, I have to build around this one card. Both are very valid ways of deck building. It's just whatever, feel free to build how you want. And then looking at what good decks should have is obviously important as well. So when you're looking at what good decks should have, you should be thinking about what in your deck is going to be your win condition. What card or cards are going to be I want these cards and I will win the game. So looking at the Patriot example, Patriot, you want him to be a card that you have. You then would also want Ultron, and ideally a Mystique, since that would copy your Patriot's ability, giving all of your drones +4 power, making them 6s. So you would say that these two cards are your win conditions. If you pull those, you have a pretty good chance of winning the game, because that's what you're building your deck around. A similar idea goes for Destroy, right? Deadpool Null would be one of your biggest win conditions, and then looking at like a Deadpool and Death being two other really good options to win. But this deck's a lot more flexible because it's a concept. You can win in other ways. You also have options like Sarah decks that have a different sort of win condition. This is more so applying a lot of cards and disrupting what your opponent wants to do so you can win. Sarah would be your win condition. Playing Sarah on 5 will put you in a very good position to win, and then utilizing cards like Shang and Enchantress will also help. So that's just an idea of what cards do you want to pull to win a game. And then the next thing is I'm breaking up it into two categories: tech cards and disruption cards. You'll see them defined interchangeably a lot of the time, like a tech card is a disruption card. I'm making it distinct for my purposes. So what I'm calling a tech card is a card that directly impacts a card that your opponent played. So the card is already on the board and you're doing something to affect what that card wants to be doing. So the most popular is Shang, that just removes the big card from the board. You have Red Guardian, which is extremely popular right now. It removes the text of your opponent's card and inflicts -2 power on it. So it can be very devastating to cards like Dracula that have low power and that also want to wait until the end of the game to have their effect happen. You have Killmonger, which I mentioned earlier, destroys the small cards. Juggernaut, which pushes all of the opponent's cards that were played there out of the lane, assuming they can be moved out of the lane, which has been seeing a rise in popularity, being able to basically just secure you a lane on its own. And Cosmo is also very popular right now because ongoing decks are very popular. So he's an ongoing card that prevents on-reveal cards from happening, which prevents things like Shang from happening or Guardian, so it protects your cards behind it as well as disrupting what your opponent wants to do. And then disruption cards. I am saying disruption are cards that do not directly impact cards that your opponent has already played. So you have cards like Iceman, which increases the cost in hand, Org, and Rockslide, which add cards to your opponent's deck, making their card draw less desirable. Black Widow, which prevents your opponent from drawing cards. Debris, adding clutter to your opponent's deck, same with Hobgoblin. Rocket and Groot and Negasonic. You're placing a barrier on the board, so your opponent has to either not play into that location or think about how they want to play around those cards. Quake, shaking up locations, changing what's happening that your opponent has to try to react to then. Scarlet Witch, just think of this as any location changing card. I'm using Scarlet Witch as the example. Nocturne, Magic Storm, all would fall in that category. Magic, not so much, but all would fall into that category. Changing locations is very disruptive to the game. It's a third of the game is the locations on the board, so being able to change one can be very disruptive. And then you have cost increasers, so Gorgon increasing generated cards, and Triple M preventing cost reduction from your opponent. So if they're running like a Sarah strategy or a Ravonna strategy or something like that, Mobius can really shut those cards down and make it hard for those decks to function properly. So generally a good deck will utilize one, if not both, of these categories. And then you'll also, when you're thinking about a deck, you're going to be thinking about how do I get around these cards. So Shang-Chi, being a very prevalent card constantly in the meta, should be at the forefront of every deck builder's minds. Knowing that 10 power cards can be destroyed by Shang, it's smart to build either around that, knowing I can just run cards that have 9 power and I'm safe, or run cards that prevent Shang from destroying your cards, such as Cosmo or Armor. So it's good to not only think about running tech cards in your deck, but think about how do I get around these problems, since my opponent will also likely be doing the same thing. So an example of how to utilize disruption is in the very popular Darkhawk disruption. Hasn't been so popular recently, but historically has been very popular. This deck utilizes Korg, can utilize Gorgon, Moon Knight, Black Widow, Rockslide, and Shang-Chi. So it's running 5 disruption cards and a tech card as well. And then pair that with Iron Lad, which just takes the text of one of these cards, and then Grandmaster, which can duplicate the effect of one of your unreveal cards. And you have a very disruptive deck that also has a very large top end at Darkhawk, which can easily end up being a 5-15 on its own, not mentioning the fact that you were heavily disrupting what your opponent wants to do. So this is just an example of how you can kind of combine all of those effects. Another deck type to think about when doing that would be Mill. I don't have a Mill deck. Or Sarah Control. So Sarah, instead of having a win condition that has lots of power, wants to just destroy and disrupt and prevent your opponent from having more power. So it uses cards like Rocket Raccoon, Juggernaut, Shang-Chi, Enchantress to remove your opponent's text or cards from the board, reduce their power, and not let them be played where your opponent wanted to play them originally. And then pair that with just some generically good cards that can get very high power, like Galacta adding power to your cards, Gwenpool doing the same, Captain Carter, Sam Wilson just being a good on-rate card, Blizzard and Iron Patriot. So these are just things to think about, and it's good to know. Another thing that I would also say be wary of is be wary of the card auto-generate, the deck auto-generate feature. The tool can be very useful if you're thinking, oh, I want to just build a deck around this card, but I don't know how. You can try to do this, but be very careful. The deck generator is not perfect. If you look at this deck, you go, yeah, no, this deck makes sense. It's an ongoing deck, and Patriot has an ongoing effect. Patriot's effect is not getting utilized in this deck at all. There is not a single ability-less card in this deck. So it can be a good tool in some cases, but it can also be very chaotic and be not very useful. So I'd say be very hesitant when using the auto-generate feature, because it can make some very not good decks, as well as don't be discouraged to just take creators' decks, right? They're here to create decks. That's what we do. So be more than willing to take the deck, but I would encourage you to think about the deck that you're running. Just because I run a deck and I think the deck is really fun and feels really good, like this Morph deck, that doesn't mean you're going to think it's fun and feel really good for you. Because for me, this like mill style deck is very fun and it feels good. And you might think it also feels good, but you might not like the way that Misery feels in the deck. So don't be afraid to realize, hey, this card feels kind of bad, and then tweak from there, because then you're learning what you like and don't like, and it can help you build and adapt in the future. And this is another idea of building around a card. Just to kind of prove a point, it's easy to build around obvious build around cards. I asked Dom, I was like, name me a random card that I can build around. He told me to build around Morph. So Morph has the on reveal of become a copy of a card in your opponent's hand. So when I'm looking at this, I go, I want Morph to be a really big card. So a really big card, as we saw earlier, they tend to be at that high cost range. So is there a way that I can remove the low cost cards or the low power cards from my opponent's hand, so that way Morph will guarantee become a big power card? So the first place that I looked was Yondu. Yondu has the on reveal that banished the card that costs the least in your opponent's deck. So that's just getting rid of the smallest card in my opponent's deck, which is going to be all the way at the top, which is going to have low power. That's good. We can then pair that with a Grandmaster to have the effect happen again. We can have Firehair, so if the card gets destroyed, the on reveal happens again. And then Misery, which destroys a card and then duplicates the on reveal. Baron Zemo does a similar thing to Yondu. It recruits the lowest cost card from your opponent's deck and plays it next to him, once again making it more likely for our Morph to hit that high power card that we want. And then we have Black Bolt, which discards the lowest cost card from our opponent's hand. So we just have a lot of tools that are removing the lowest cost cards from our opponent's hand, ensuring we're hitting a high cost and impactful card with our 3-0. The last being Doc Ock, which pulls the lowest power card from our opponent's hand. Right? So generally that's going to be a small card. There are situations where that could be bad, right? And maybe it pulls an Iron Man because that's a 0 power card. But generally, it'll pull a cheap card that we didn't want our Morph to hit. So all of this will enable us to play a cheap Morph. And then just rounding out the deck, because this was the concept, right? Rounding out the deck, you have Hood, which pairs extremely well with Firehair, Misery, and Grandmaster. Misery gets it off the board, and then we get a bunch of demons as well from it. And Stature, since if we can discard our opponent's card with Black Bolt, Stature will become a 1/7, which is just a very good cost card. 7 power for 1 stat, that's not being killed by Killmonger, is very good. And you'll notice in the deck we have a lot of disruption, right? We have Yondu removing cards from our opponent's deck, Zemo doing the same thing, Black Bolt removing cards from our opponent's hand, and Doc Ock pulling cards from our opponent's hand. And then we have Tech in Shang, and then Fenris being able to resurrect a card from our opponent, the highest power card that was discarded or destroyed. And since we have two ways of doing that, Fenris can also help us win a lane. So yeah, this is just kind of giving an idea of what building a building a deck around a card can be like. It doesn't need to be a win condition card necessarily. It can just be a, hey, I really like this card, let's try and make it work. This is actually the deck I'm going to showcase in my video tomorrow. So if you're watching this video on the day it comes out, it won't be out yet. But if you are watching this at a later date, you can go see how well this deck actually performs. And but sometimes it's just fun to have a good deck, like a funny deck, right? Morph isn't necessarily an amazing card, but it's fun. It's fun to gamble on him and see what he'll turn into. So that's kind of what I wanted to just talk about today. Wanted to speak about deck building, and I know it was very broad strokes, kind of covered a lot of information, but I didn't want to go too in detail about tech cards and that stuff. If this video does well and gets like 50 likes, I'll say I can go into more in-depth deck building, talk about tech cards specifically, how to run them, what to consider, or disruption cards, win conditions, whatever it may be. I can do more in-depth videos if this does well. But anyway, if you guys enjoyed, please leave a like, comment, letting me know, subscribe for future deck highlights, and I'll see you in the next one.